Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, Navigating the New Normal, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and the economy, real estate and technology, medicine and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plout. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 National American Charitable Organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence. It serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. We would like to share an overview of the work being done at the Rabin Medical Center.
Rabin Medical Center, located nearby Tel Aviv, is one of Israel's largest and most advanced academic hospitals, named after former Israeli Prime Minister and Nobel Prize winner for Peace Yitzhak Rabin. Comprising Bellinson and Hasharon campuses, it has been a national leader in medicine, science, and compassion towards patients since its founding in 1936. As the flagship hospital of Israel's largest healthcare provider, Clalit, with more than 8,200 dedicated staff members, RMC gives treatment to around 1 million patients every year, performs more than 70% of all organ transplants, and provides health care to every 6th cancer patient in the country. RMC is a home for internationally acclaimed centers of excellence, including Davidoff Cancer Center, Samueli Institute for Cancer Research, and a new brain and heart center, the Tower of Hope. Through groundbreaking research, AI-driven medicine, cutting-edge technologies, and global collaborations, RMC is redefining what is possible in modern healthcare. In moments of peace and in times of war, we stand on the front line. As a main trauma center, RMC is healing soldiers and civilians, reuniting families, and strengthening the Israeli social fabric and resilience. Delivering not only world-class treatment, but also human connection, healing, and hope. Rabin Medical Center, a beacon of innovation, excellence, and care.
Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. And now, on to today's program. Today's Global Connections topic is America's housing crisis. Thank you to our very special guests, Elena Patel, co-director of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center, Boaz Abramson, Professor of Finance at Columbia University. David Smith, founder and chairman of the Affordable Housing Institute. Bess Freedman, Chief Executive Officer of Brown Harris Stevens. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. We have in our country a housing shortage. Many would call it a housing crisis. Housing accounts for a big chunk of the broader problem we speak of as affordability. People in their 20s working at entry-level jobs can't find a place to live that's within their budget and within a distance from work that makes for a manageable commute. Growing families eager to move into something a little more spacious might find that the price of doing so is 2 hours a day in the car. For reasons that we'll hear about, I hope, in this hour, there's just not enough new housing being built to accommodate the population. We have an excellent panel on hand to talk about the housing shortage and what can be done about it. I'll interview each one on one, and then we'll have a question and answer session, a discussion session. If you're watching us live, you can propose a question by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and I'll be able to read it and possibly put it to our guests. Our first panelist, Elena Patel, is co-director of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. She worked on housing during the Biden administration as senior public finance economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. At Brookings, she was involved in a study that measured the size of the housing shortage, and that study was released last fall. Elena Patel, first, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
That study that I mentioned concluded that there's a shortage of dwellings nationwide numbering 4.9 million. But you also found that figuring out how to measure that shortage is no easy business. Why is that?
Yeah, a shortage of housing is different than a shortage of goods that we buy in the grocery store. So sometimes you might think of a shortage as I can't get toilet paper when I go to the grocery store and it's just not there. Housing is not quite the same in that when there's a shortage of housing, households shift and adjust to make sure that they are housed somewhere. And so a housing shortage looks very different and it can look like extra roommates where you might not otherwise expect them, or delayed household formation, or the canonical 26-year-old in their parents' basement. All of these things are all symptoms of a housing shortage, and because people are housed, it can be hard to measure exactly what the housing shortage is.
Actually, it's very peculiar. If somebody buys a house where a couple lived and then takes in three roommates who pay rent for their rooms, that person can be seen as expanding the housing supply, even though there's been no construction of.
Exactly. That's right. That's exactly right. So that's what's complicated about measuring the shortage.
So, with all those complexities, you came up with our economy is short about 4.9, excuse me, 4,900,000 dwellings. Is that shortage pretty random around the country, or should we expect to find it much more in some regions or in some kinds of regions?
Yeah, that shortage is a national number, but you should expect that there's quite a lot of variation across the country for reasons I think are probably pretty intuitive to most people. In dense urban areas, especially dense urban areas that don't have a lot of very tall buildings, the housing shortage can look different than in suburban areas. There are housing shortages in rural areas, and this all relates a little bit to population flows. And so, as populations have left New England and gone to the southeast of the United States, the shortage has kind of followed the population flows. So it certainly varies across the country.
And then there are places you mentioned to me, Park City, Utah, when we
Right.
spoke, and it reminded me of what I've heard about Steamboat Springs, Colorado, which is there are jobs there, but
Yes.
there's hardly any place that people who get those jobs can afford to live.
That's exactly right. And so the affordability crisis and the housing shortage also depends on where you are in the income distribution, where people in the middle and the bottom face a shortage that people at the top don't face. So there are a lot of dimensions of the shortage.
I assume that a shortage of 4.9 million dwellings is a lot bigger than it would have been 25 or 40 years ago. I don't know what the number
Yeah,
would have been.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So we usually think of the housing shortage now as compared to some point when we last thought the market was working pretty well. And so my measure, for example, is relative to the early 2000s before the housing crisis and the great financial recession. And up until the early 2000s, construction of new housing seemed to be keeping up with population flows. That doesn't mean there weren't any housing shortages, but it wasn't the size and scope of what we face today.
So what happened? What
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, certainly there was a very large slowdown in the construction of new homes following the great financial crisis. And a lot of people will point to that at a minimum as one of the turning points for the housing supply shortage. We stopped constructing homes in the wake of the great financial crisis, and then construction really never ramped back up to where it was before that point in time. I would say there's also other pressures we've had, especially in recent years. Labor supply has been disrupted through immigration enforcement. That's a population that's especially important for constructing homes. And then also, as I like to say, it's a really tough federal policy nut to crack because the federal government doesn't have a lot of control over the way housing regulation is imposed. That's really a state and local jurisdiction issue. And so there's a lack of coordination across cities around the whole country to solve the affordable housing crisis.
And does the shortage in any way reflect the demographic shifts of whether young people are getting married and having children less
Yeah,
or not? Yeah.
those things are all related. And some people think that delayed household formation has led to lower marriage rates, potentially with fertility effects, as people are waiting to move into that phase of their life until they have sorted out their housing problems. And so there are all kinds of demographic implications of the housing supply shortage.
And you haven't mentioned permitting issues,
Right.
but do they are they a nationwide phenomenon?
Yes. Yes. They're a nationwide phenomenon. They're a problem in every city across the country and a different problem in every city across the country because every city imposes its own parking regulations and building height regulations and zoning. And all of those frictions are the frictions that have resulted in what is now a 5 million unit housing shortage.
Well, Elena, stick with us because we're going to come back for the discussion period in a
Great.
little while. But thanks so much for
Yeah.
what you're
Thank
doing.
you.
Our second panelist, Boaz Abramson, Assistant Professor of Finance at Columbia Business School at Columbia University. He is also affiliated with the school's Center on Real Estate. The focus of his work is housing markets, so he's very much on the money here. Boaz Abramson, thanks for taking part.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here.
I have found myself recently using the term affordable housing without actually defining it, and it occurred to me I don't really know what makes something affordable. It obviously isn't just the rent or the mortgage payment. It's a relationship with what people are seeking. How is affordable defined?
So it's a good question. There's not sort of one agreed upon definition of affordability, but the typical definition that people use has to do with the ratio of housing costs to income. So how much of your income do you have to spend on housing costs? If you're a renter, that would be the rent. If you're an owner, that would be your mortgage payments. And so typically people refer to rent burdened or housing burdened as paying more than 30% of your income on housing. And extremely burdened would be paying more than 50% of your income on housing.
I remember ages ago trying to make these calculations. Does income mean gross income or how much money you actually have after you've paid a lot of taxes?
Yeah, so that also varies, different definitions, but the typical one is gross income. And in the United States, for example, the share of renters who are extremely rent burdened, that is paying more than 50% of their income on rent, is something like 30%. So 1 in 3 renters is extremely rent burdened.
When we spoke last week about what would happen here in the panel, you made an interesting distinction. You said there's a shortage of affordable housing, but not because it's affordable. There's a shortage of housing, and that includes affordable housing as well as other housing. Um, we hear a lot more about the shortage of people just entering the job market or having incomes in the lower percentiles.
Right. So there's this idea of filtering in the housing market, which is, I think, a good way to think about the shortage and how that translates to affordability. And the argument is sort of if you build enough housing, be it, affordable or lower quality, lower tiered housing or, luxury condos, if you build more, prices will filter down the housing ladder, and that will make things more affordable even at the bottom end. And so this shortage of housing, even if there's shortage of housing on the upper end of the housing ladder, that impacts affordability in the bottom, and impacts affordability for these 26-year-olds that double up with their parents.
Let me ask you about what Elena Patel was saying earlier. When you look at the history of housing costs in the U.S., is there a pretty obvious point at which rents and mortgage payments just start accelerating?
So I think there are to me, there are sort of two inflection points like that. One is the one that Elena mentioned, which is post GFC. The other is actually around the 1970s, where you see sort of the productivity of housing, manufacturing kind of drop relative to the productivity of other types of production like cars or other industrial goods. So we've become less proficient in building housing. And I think this relates to, and that happened around the 1970s. And not surprisingly, it coincides quite closely with the time where zoning restrictions and all these things became more pervasive. So I think to me that's kind of the big story.
I should say also, I remember from the 1970s, that was pretty much the beginning of public housing projects being literally blown up. I mean, the most vivid declaration of failure of a policy one can imagine, from St. Louis to Newark and Chicago. We were simply destroying a stock of public housing that just hadn't, it had not created the neighborhoods that had been hoped. Um, if the increase in the cost of buying or renting a home is out of line with the increased cost of buying, is it that much more expensive relative to 50 years ago or 20 years ago than the price of cars or the price of washing machines or other big ticket items?
Yeah, so today the number of annual incomes that you would have to make in order to afford your median house in the United States is much higher than it used to be. Um, and again, maybe one comment on the public housing because I think that's important. So I'm here at Columbia Business School where there's quite a lot of public housing around me, but we've as a country stopped building public housing since the 1970s, maybe destroyed some. And so that obviously contributes to the lack of affordable housing.
Oddly, when we spoke last week, you told me about seeing manufactured housing units. I don't know if it's the same thing as prefab, but the current phrase is manufactured housing on display in Washington, D.C. And you were blown away by it, by how good these housing units were. What did you see? Describe.
Yeah, so I mean, one way to build very cheap housing is to build manufactured housing, right? Which means that you basically build almost everything in a factory and then you just take it on site and kind of put the things together. And that makes production very cheap. And so I went kind of, you would think that manufactured housing is kind of maybe a lower quality type of product, but actually when you see these things, I was, as you said, blown away by how good they looked. Like it was actually 3D printed manufactured housing in an exhibition outside of the White House. And they were amazing. As someone who grew up in Israel, to me, these look like mansions. I would be very happy to live in one of those. But a lot of zoning restrictions in a lot of places in the country prohibit these types of housing for very particular historical reasons that are kind of maintained today through the fact that these zoning restrictions are made at the very local level. I think that's sort of an important point to touch upon, which is the political economy of these zoning restrictions that prohibit, among others, manufactured housing.
Which would, in theory, if there were a market, if the market were opened to them, you would think that actually they would do very well.
Definitely. I mean, these are houses that cost 10% relative to the ones that are built on site. So it would substantially lower the cost of building, the cost of material, of labor, and that would lower the price of housing.
Professor Abramson, thanks a lot, and stick with us because in
Thank you.
about 10 minutes we'll be calling you back to join the conversation. Our next panelist is David Smith of Cambridge, Massachusetts, who is devoted to the cause of creating affordable housing. Mr. Smith is the founder and chair of the Affordable Housing Institute. As his online bio puts it, he, and I'm quoting, combines the roles of practitioner and theoretician, participant and policymaker in the affordable housing sector. And I should add that while we are focusing on the U.S. housing market, he has been a policy advisor on housing finance policy and an affordable housing program developer in countries on 5 continents. Dave Smith, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Nice to be here.
So let's start with one word, zoning. Among the causes of the shortage of affordable housing, how important is zoning?
Number one, but there's about 4 others that are related to the obstacles that both Elena and Boaz addressed. Development barriers of all kinds. First of all, what zoning is, how vertically it can be. Second, do you have zoning as of right? Or do you have to go before the NIMBY-DAFE sequence of getting individual approvals for everything? Then you've got the building materials, and Boaz is absolutely right about manufactured housing. It cuts hard cost by about 20 to 30%, and it cuts speed to market by about 50% if you can implement it. And then the last one is the weaponization of environmental review and things of that sort as an excuse to delay the delivery of new housing. To go back to Elena's point and to connect what Boaz also said, as of right zoning in America largely died in 1985, and we didn't notice it. And that slowed down time to market. Couple that with the shortage, with not so much public housing, because we create affordable housing, which is public-private partnership, but we have not delivered on it. So what has happened, you were having trouble with your arithmetic? 25 years ago, the median house in America cost 3 times the median income in America. Today, the median house in America costs 5 times the median income. This is extraordinary, and it is a self-inflicted problem.
Define the term of zoning that you're using.
Zoning, to begin with, says what land will be used for, but it doesn't stop with the factories over here and the houses over there and the shopping centers over there. It also covers verticality. How high up can you go? How much setback do you have to have from the street? How much do you, what is it, how much do you have to have for parking? Elena mentioned parking. Parking eats up an enormous part of the streetscape, which made sense in 1975 and makes negative sense now. So all sorts of things that we put in place as local, municipal, state level laws have had the effect of preserving some nice enclaves like the one I live in, where 3 miles away, other people live in high density, but you can't develop where I live into what could be higher density. So yes, it is a huge part of the problem.
So I'm a native New Yorker who grew up in an apartment. I think at around age 11, I finally met people who lived in private homes, in individual homes. Apartment living struck me as entirely normal. New York had accommodated its growing population by growing vertically and putting up a lot of apartment buildings. I now live in a suburb of Washington, D.C., a metropolitan area that has accommodated its growth by moving horizontally until you finally are so far away from the city that it no longer works unless you're working from home. Is the problem that our suburbs have expanded beyond the range of decent mass transit? Is the transportation problem curtailing where we can build effectively?
Partly, but I'm going to give you an equation. 1 = 1 + 1. I'm a high school graduate. I have checked this on an AI calculator. It's accurate. Every time you add 1 job to your metropolitan area, you have to add plus or minus 1 housing unit and 1 round trip commute per day, per workday. Now that's grossly oversimplified. But when you start having job creation that is physically distant from housing creation, you put stress on all of your transportation modalities. The flip side is that when you run the metro all the way out to Dulles Airport, every place along the metro suddenly booms with housing demand. And if you don't zone for verticality, you have wasted the value of the mass transit that you have put in place. So you have to think at the metropolitan or larger than city level to connect job creation, which everybody wants, incomes rising, which everybody wants, mass transit, which almost everybody wants, and by the way, put some housing all around all of that. Don't consign it to the outer burbs. Put it vertically in the stuff that's going up now.
You know, a lot of vertical stuff that's been built in recent decades is full of one-bedroom and two-bedroom apartments, and
Yep.
places which, for Washington, you can imagine the number of people, companies that maintain a pied-à-terre and really want to have a studio apartment or a one-bedroom apartment. But it's very hard, I think, to find apartments that have three bedrooms and two baths and a family could live in for 20 years. Um, are developers reading American tastes and building what people want or say they need, or are people limited by what builders are building, builders who could actually build otherwise if they chose?
Builders are omnivorous. If you give them a value proposition for a particular household type with a piece of land that they can develop on and an offtake strategy, they will build whatever the market wants. However, they tend to like to make one kind of ice cream, two bedrooms, one bedrooms. The housing that all of us live in changes over the course of your life. Count sometime how many different homes you lived in, including the ones before you went off to college or otherwise. But then when you got out of college, you lived in one kind of thing, then you lived in another kind of thing, and so on. Eleanor was talking before about changes in household size. The biggest thing about human households is they change, and who heads them changes over your life. So part of the trick here is to be building different levels of housing, different price points, different modalities. That's hard to do in any individual deal. It's much easier to do in master planning. It's much easier to do in campus-based communities. So yes, you see a lot of ones and twos because you're hitting the two income, no kids model. Not seeing as much twos and threes and fours, in part because those people want yards and so on. And because zoning doesn't give us the flexibility to mix, it's harder to mix rental, short-term rental, supportive housing, owned ownership, home ownership, pardon me, plus retail, plus everything else. So what you're doing now when you work from home actually probably violates the zoning in most places, and we need to get better at zoning that stuff in, because the more you work from home, the less commute you need.
I just have one more question for you, David. You've worked on housing all around the world. What stands out to you about the American housing problem that's unique to us, or is it not so unique to us? Are we describing universal problems?
We have the oldest, most sophisticated, most complicated, and most diversified housing delivery and housing finance ecosystems in the world. Almost everybody else is more centralized. We also have a country which, compared to other developed nations, has almost an infinity of land. But we have a phenomenon that everybody is doing where our country is urbanizing dramatically. People in America move warm, wet, and west. They move from cold to warm. They move from landlocked to the ocean, and they move from east to southwest. You can't take your house with you. So we have stranded housing in a variety of places. Now, those are all the things we do well. One of the things we don't do well is understand that we do not actually have a national housing policy, and the head of the federal government does a very poor job of interacting with local governments. And I say this on an entirely bipartisan basis.
Dave Smith, thank you very much. Stick around. We'll be back to you soon. But first, we want to talk to our next panelist.
How are you, Robert? I wish I could take David and bring him to the legislators here in New York City and have him talk some common sense into them, because
Okay.
he might impact some real change, I think.
Well, let me introduce you properly. With our fourth and final panelist, we travel up market a bit. Bess Freedman is CEO of Brown Harris Stevens Residential. They manage about 400 buildings in 4 states, working with some 2,500 agents. Many of the properties they manage are in New York City, but they're also in the Hamptons, Palm Beach, New Jersey. They are known as a broker of residential properties, and Brown Harris Stevens has a lineage rooted in 19th century New York City real estate brokerage. Bess Freedman is a lawyer by training, and in addition to being CEO of this very big real estate firm, she is also on the board of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center.
Thank you so much, Robert. And just to clarify, we have 2 separate businesses. We have residential brokerage, which we have 2,700 real estate agents. And then we manage buildings, roughly about 400 buildings throughout New York City. Separate LLC, but we do both.
I went to your website and I searched it, and while I realized that this company was the exclusive agent for the sale of David Rockefeller's $30 million townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, on its map of neighborhoods, I could find my childhood stomping ground, Stuyvesant Town, and look up properties there. So it's upscale, but also includes a lot of middle scale. How residential, or how is the residential real estate business in New York City, where your company does so much work? How's it doing?
It's okay. The market is very resilient. The rates and the volatility that we see geopolitically obviously has an impact on discretionary spending. And so I think we have a new mayor, if you haven't heard, Mayor Mamdani. And so I think that's having its impact. Some of those things like potentially passing this wealth tax or increasing the transfer taxes, freezing rents, all of those things are not helpful to our market, I don't think. But the market is doing well considering all of these headwinds that we see. And it's been a decent market. The numbers are fairly flat, but the high end continues to roar. So,
I mean, at the high end, I mean, apartment buildings with 24/7 doorman service and building superintendents who are really good and who have good handymen who work for them and good amenities, that's expensive to operate. Are less luxurious buildings also profitable, or do you have to go up to the high end to make a good profit at renting?
it just, first of all, the rental market is really expensive today. It keeps going up, up, up. It's become unaffordable, which is why people are bunking into one bedrooms because they can't afford the rent. The rent is too damn high. Whoever said that, it's true. And, not all square feet are created equally. Some buildings can command something like 10,000, or the highest record was $13,000 a square foot, believe it or not.
Yeah.
It was at 15 CPW, and that was a new
At Central
development.
Park West, I should say,
That's right.
for
And
those from out of town, yes.
it still is the number one highest price per square foot ever achieved. Even the big $220 million sale was at 10,000 or so a square foot. So that is the record. But look, you can buy property for, in New York City for on the lower end at $1,000 a square foot in certain areas. So all buildings, they vary. What year were they built? Are they pre-war? Are they a co-op? Are they a condo? There's so much nuance to our market. I know media likes to paint it with a broad brush, but it's really nuanced like most things.
So, if in a neighborhood dominated by really expensive buildings, somehow or other there was a plan to put up some affordable housing, and assuming that that could actually get through, I mean, would that take down the value of high-end buildings nearby?
Not at all. In fact, we need more of that. Under Mayor Adams, he was able to pass something called City of Yes, which allowed for more zoning and gave people, it's going to increase. I think we're going to get 80,000 more units from that. So it helps when we have more, inventory in the market, it helps the overall market as a whole. And so I think that would benefit the high end and create more units for everyone. And so there's this sort of, this or that mentality, this sort of black or white, way of doing things, that the landlord is the bad guy and the tenant is the good guy. And that's how we speak today versus sort of understanding what would make sense to help everyone. And we're not having those conversations. We're in this sort of demonization environment of people.
In real estate in New York, for many years, the landlord-tenant relationship has been toxic in New York for a very long time. You said at the beginning when I was fumbling for my notes here, that you'd want Dave Smith, and we just heard, to talk to the city council. What is it that you feel that local government doesn't get about housing?
Well, I think things like rent freezing only hurts supply. I mean, he's talking about the stabilized units. We have right now 50,000 stabilized units in New York City that are empty. And so when you freeze rents for those stabilized units, how are the landlords who own those units going to make upgrades or improvements or pay their own bills? And so I think what I'm saying is, I've been to city council, I've testified there on, bills that I thought were really hurtful to our environment, but the truth is that they don't have substance to back up the bills they're trying to pass, and they won't listen to people who are experts in the market. The public and the private sector have to work together. You have to incentivize developers with things like we had a 421A, now it's 485X. There are tax incentives, so when a builder, like, puts up a building, there's an affordable component, and he gets a benefit because developers have to be able to also pay bills. Of course, they're gonna make money, but, it's not a zero-sum game, and I think the challenge that we really have is that we've become so divided that nobody really listens to each other. So I'm hoping that I can hire David to come to New York City, and I'm gonna get him to help us and talk some common sense into the people here so we can get a better environment overall.
I should explain to people unfamiliar with it that stabilization, rent stabilization, was kind of the second regime of what originally was rent control in New York, that buildings built before World War II were really subjected to very strict controls, and rent stabilization was applied to buildings built later on. My wife and I once lived in one when we were first married, and when our daughter was born, we couldn't fit anymore in the apartment. And a couple of floors down in the building was a couple who had raised a family there, who had all grown up, and now their grandchildren were nearby. And they were sort of interested in trading apartments with us. I mean, they needed what we had, and we needed what they had. The problem was that our one-bedroom apartment was more expensive for them than the whatever it was, three-bedroom apartment that they had, because they had been in it so long through rent stabilization, and we had not. There are all kinds of
There's all these
future
things that are
outcomes.
yeah, that are sort of they're hard to sort of there still are some rent-controlled units, and there's a good glut of rent stabilized, and so it's tricky, it's a tricky sort of situation because the free market, you get a studio today, and it's $3,000 a month for a small, teeny little box, and what Elena was talking about, like, I think it was Elena or is Boaz, I don't know, I took some notes on the debt to income challenge,
Mhm.
like,
Uh,
today, the
the
first time
bars.
home buyer today, their average age is roughly 40 years old. Compare that to, even just 10 years ago or a little more, they were 28. It's people have been totally priced out of being able to afford, their first time home, and we need to solve for that. I know I'm in discretionary and the high end of the market, but I still care about housing because, it's the dream. It is the American dream.
Well, Bess, I want to ask you, and also ask all of our panelists now as they come back, what is some housing policy that you think would help alleviate the housing shortage? And what is a proposed housing policy that you think would do no good at all? So let me uh, ask you first, Bess, and
I mean, I think some upzoning would be very helpful.
upzoning.
Yeah, places so that people can build vertically and do more of that so that we can supply the market in a better way. Because the things that David was talking about regarding zoning, and he's the expert and understands it in a way that I do not. But I do know that we are so restricted by state and local to get anything done or anything passed, that it's hard to move it forward. And I think if we could relax or come up with smarter zoning policies like City of Yes, we would be in a better position.
And some popular idea that you think is a terrible idea for trying to alleviate the housing crisis.
Rent freezes.
Rent freezes. And as I just described my my experience with that, Dave Smith, what to you is something that we should do, and actually would likely have some effect on the on.
Well, Boaz made reference to public housing. Public housing, some of the public housing that was demolished, Boaz, absolutely deserved to. Pruitt-Igoe, Robert Taylor Homes, the ones down in Atlanta. But there's a lot of public housing, including a lot of housing owned by NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, that is vertically obsolete. What I mean by that is it has a big footprint and it has 4-story and 5-story family units that you can't go higher on. We have a bunch of that up here in Boston. We've done some work for NYCHA, helping them monetize the latent value in their vertically obsolete campuses. We also work up here in Boston for the tenants in an existing public housing project in Charlestown, Massachusetts, that's 1,000 units, where the public housing tenants association, the city housing authority, and a private developer signed a tri-party development agreement under which every brick and stick from 1941 on that site disappears, and in its place, 2,699 new units come up that are mixed income, including public housing eligible coming back. That was fueled by that increase in zoning that we're talking about, coupled with, Bess, you made reference to 421A and 485X, which are 10 or 15-year real estate tax abatements. The flip side of that is something called tax increment financing, where a city borrows money based on the expected increase in real estate taxes that it will get going forward for developing it up higher. So you have to start to think as a city about how you mobilize low verticality, low usage, physically obsolescent land and spaces into higher density affordable housing with, I want to emphasize, buy-in from the community and the tenants. As I say, I've been representing the tenants at that particular public housing project for 8 years. There's a lot they need to learn. There's a lot they do learn, and their voice does matter.
And briefly, what's a bad idea that is enjoying some discussion?
Rent control. It has never worked anywhere. They put it in Bombay about the same time they put it in New York City. I can show you buildings in Bombay that are falling down because they have not had the ability to maintain them. It was used in Cairo. I have been in buildings in Cairo that were falling down where the people did not maintain the facades whatsoever. I have had rent control is the knee-jerk reaction to a short-term crisis. And I will tell you, I have said on other contexts that it is the equivalent of heroin for urban neighborhoods.
Okay.
It was good the first time, it's addictive and you can't kick it. My first apartment after college was a rent-controlled apartment in the People's Republic of Cambridge. So I have firsthand experience of what you're describing when it goes wrong.
Okay. Boaz Abramson, what's something that you think could actually work and something that can't?
So I think one thing that is worth bringing to the table is the political economy of this and the reason why we have zoning restrictions and at what level of government they're set. So typically zoning restrictions are set at the very local level, so city, county, maybe state, not at the federal level as Dave was mentioning. And so that's a problem because, if housing is not affordable in New York, then people move from New York somewhere else and housing becomes unaffordable there. And so one way to kind of shift or get rid of zoning is to shift the political power to the federal level. So one good example for this, not the federal level, but at the state level, is recent legislation in California that basically required localities to allow ADUs and required localities to allow for a certain number of new developments.
ADUs.
So kind of ADUs, sorry, attached dwelling units.
Dwelling units.
These are the granny units that people refer to. And so, one way to alleviate zoning restrictions, accessory dwelling units. Thank you, David. And so one way to alleviate zoning restrictions is to shift the political power to a higher level, state or government. So that I think is important to realize. I'm guessing you're going to ask me about a policy that I don't like.
Yes.
So I can say rent control. I completely agree with that, but I'll also add another thing to the table, which is these ideas of sort of subsidizing home ownership for buyers. So you hear that on a bipartisan level from both sides of the political spectrum, right? So the would-be Harris administration proposed $25,000 of cash transfers for first-time home buyers. That's a classic policy that sounds great, but is a demand-driven policy instead of a supply-driven policy. And so you increase demand without increasing supply. What would that do? Econ 101 would say this increases prices.
Yeah.
So that's also a bad type of policy.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And Elena, what is something that that could actually work to address the housing shortage? And are you going to defend rent control? I'm just curious if there are any defenders.
No, nobody will defend rent control. I think anybody who studied housing is never going to defend it. To say something different, because I think we can all talk about zoning in different ways, and I think that actually just reflects how important the zoning frictions are. And again, as I said at the start, how hard it is from a political economy standpoint to really shift those. I would want to highlight public housing authorities and the need for public subsidies to build affordable housing. That's not where the market will go naturally. You sort of have to lean into public funds to nudge those things. And what I'll highlight right now, and since 2021, is we've been in a very high and volatile interest rate environment. And that actually makes it very hard to finance public housing. And so the federal government has a way to subsidize this through the Federal Financing Bank and some tools in their toolkits to help public housing authorities lift up these projects and kind of smooth out what is hopefully a short-term high interest rate environment for housing projects that will provide housing for the next 30 years. And so I do actually think this is an area where the federal government is somewhat uniquely situated to help these smaller public housing authorities. The larger ones have figured out how to interest rate lock their way through this with one-on-one relationships with banks, but the smaller ones have not figured that out, and they probably won't and will need the federal government's help to do that. So something different to think about. And then something I hate. So again, I could say anything demand side, I completely agree, is it's along the lines of these populist political messages like no tax on tips, I'm a tax person. Those things sound really great and don't do exactly the thing that they sound like they do. To add to this demand side solution, I also think that these bans on institutional investors sound really popular, but are meaningless in the context of the housing supply shortage and actually harmful for renters, because institutional investors tend to own single family homes that renters wouldn't have access to neighborhoods if not for the institutional investors buying those homes. And there is evidence that when they purchase these homes, they're in better condition, they're better managed, and so it can be a better situation for renters. And so I think when people hear a ban on institutional investors, they're sort of ignoring the fact that what we're talking about is renters versus owners in a home that exists already. It's not really about the housing supply shortage, but who goes into those homes. And they actually play a pretty important role for renters. And so I think that those bans are also quite misguided.
Now, you said something which has been implicit in what all of you have been saying, which is that the market won't go there on its own. That is to provide housing for lower income Americans, and I'm trying to trying to understand that. That is, there are 1/4 of the U.S., if the third quartile of the population is about 90 million people, and I think that there's some demand that some enterprising people would want to buy land, break ground, and build housing. Why not? Well, why? What doesn't check out about that, Elena?
I just think it's the opportunity cost of what type of project you're going to take on. Boaz mentioned that we've had a slowdown in housing production and productivity, really, that started back in the 70s. And the truth is that we have a shortage in the type of housing we've been building that has been building for a while, which are these starter homes. And so developers, when choosing amongst the projects to put on a particular parcel, as David mentioned, the thing that they're not choosing right now is starter homes. And so without starter homes in the filtering and laddering system, those people are going to other types of housing that don't meet their needs, and it ripples through the entire system.
David, do I have that right? That the market on its own is just not going to put up the kind of housing that would suit the third quartile of the population?
The price of housing ultimately relates to the land use economics of the development of a particular parcel.
Mm-hmm.
We've said a bunch of unkind things about zoning up to now, but one of the things that you can do with zoning is you can either zone public land for reuse and specify its purpose. So you're putting land into circulation, or you can zone agricultural land or peri-urban land in the suburbs for affordable housing before you go. Zoning is in effect a land use cartel controlled by municipal government. If the municipal government wants to assure that affordable housing goes in certain places, a kind of zoning that you can do, we have not mentioned up to now, inclusionary zoning.
Mm-hmm.
To say, I've got a 10-story building in the East 30s. I want to tear it down. I want to put a 40-story building there. Makes all the sense in the world. Great. You need somebody's approval for that. Great. We'll change the economics so that it's not pure economics, like we'll get vacant condos to people from South America. But what we'll say is we'll let you go from 10 to 40 stories if for every 3 square feet of FAR you get, Bess, you have to create 1 square foot of affordable. That's been done in Bombay, Sao Paulo, among other places, as well as Boston, and in 880 jurisdictions in the United States, where you have an inclusive zoning with a density bonus that is calibrated into the market. So Boaz and Elena, it's got to be a little different out in Iowa City than it would be in San Francisco. But if you sprinkle it in, you're essentially, Robert, making an invisible tax on land value or invisible tax on the increase in land value, what the Brits call planning value gain. And it does work, but you have to be a little bit patient. The other one I would say, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, outside of DC, created the Housing Opportunities Commission to acquire property and land and inventory it and become a land bank for the public benefit. That's something slightly different from the Housing Authority, but they've been very successful, aided in no small part by the expansion of Washington, D.C. and the red line going up to PG County.
Yeah. Boaz, you assume that there has to be a government role to get affordable housing built, but I gather you would want it to be not just every county setting its own rules for who can build what. Do I have that right?
I mean, I think it's a combination of market supply, and I do agree with Elena that there is room for government intervention here. And I think sort of when you have this discussion, I think there are two ways to have this discussion. One is kind of a moral discussion on whether we care about low-income families, right? And you know, some people might care and some people might not. That's kind of a subjective opinion. But what I think we can all agree on, and I think is the better way to kind of think about or convince policymakers to implement a certain policy, is the fiscal costs and benefits of different types of policies. You know, if we're not building, if we're not funding LIHTC, low income housing tax credit, and if we're not building public housing, then people don't have anywhere to live. They become homeless, and that is extremely costly. So New York City spends $4 billion every year, $4 billion every year on homelessness services, right? And so you can imagine it's kind of easy to do the math and convince yourself that building housing is less expensive than funding all this social welfare program. So I do think we're at a point in time where there is room for government intervention.
Bess Freedman, you're still taking notes?
I'm just listening because it's when Boaz was talking, I was thinking there are 2 people that are parked and sleeping in front of my building, you know, every day. I'm on I'm on the board of of an organization, not for profit, called The Bridge, and we build affordable housing. We built 28 buildings throughout New York City and Brooklyn, and provide services to people who suffer from mental illness and drug addiction and those sorts of things. It's not just the fact that it costs money, it's an emotional, you know, it's horrible that we're in a first world country with all these resources and we can't solve for that. We can't get people off the street and get them, you know, roof over their head and the services that we need. We're not able to do that. It's a disappointment, just in how we behave as human beings, and we have failed greatly in that regard.
Although, as you said, that's not simply a housing problem. I mean, there are issues of
Of course. There's
the institutional
externalities,
therapy.
meaning the homeless,
Yeah.
you see people on the street, but it's also that they're struggling, they're suffering. Sometimes they're suffering from schizophrenia and there's, somebody can get, pushed on a train track and all these things will happen because we're not taking care of people and people need help and support and so on. But it's so, it's a challenging topic.
Can I
No
just, I
city
want, I just,
thought,
I feel like
sorry,
I
Bob.
need to intervene here because there's this, I mean, it's not something that Bess said, but just to, I think, useful to clarify. There is this misconception on the homeless population that this is largely, this is a population that experiences mental illness at very high levels. I think that's the wrong, based on the data, that's the wrong perception of that population. The reason we have that perception is because the ones that are most visible are the ones with the most severe mental illness. But actually, mental illness rates are not are higher in the homeless population relative to the general population, but not that much higher. They're like 30% among people who experience homelessness and around 20% in the general population. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
I think that's super important. Yeah, I
Elena, I saw you, I think, nodding in agreement to what you were hearing.
Yeah, actually, I think that's very right. And there's obviously a connection between housing supply shortages and homelessness, but it's not at the linear line that we think it is between those two things. So I just think the richness of this conversation is really important. Mental health issues are a part of this. Part of it is it's unaffordable to find housing, but there is so much going on here that the services that Bess is describing that are provided to the homeless population are as important as finding the home itself. It's a complicated picture.
And Dave Smith, I guess I'd just ask you to wrap it up with on a positive note. That is, there's so many places where zoning issues and NIMBY issues prevent housing from going up. Where are the success stories? What do you point to and say, that city there, look at what they've done. That's really working.
I'll give you two cities that do it, and then I'm going to give you a 4th century view of the positives.
Okay.
The two cities that do it are Singapore, which is sui generis, but has the Singapore Housing Development Board, where the government is the dominant deliverer of housing and has the benefit, Boaz, of controlling the verticality most of the time. The second one currently is Austin, Texas, which is getting a lot of people coming in, but it's also responded to that by an aggressive vertical housing boom. Now, the thing I want to end with, the first affordable housing that was purpose-built in the United States of America, as far as I can tell, was in 1630 by a guy named John Winthrop, who was on a boat coming to America to become the British governor of Massachusetts. And on that boat ride, he wrote the essay that gave the phrase, "A shining city on the hill."
Yes.
Right? And when he became governor, he got a law passed to create almshouses and poor houses in Boston. And housing the poor, housing the indigent, housing those who need it is a foundational tenet of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I've worked in all three of those countries. I've worked in Israel, I've worked in Saudi Arabia, I've worked in America, needless to say. Faith-based institutions have a potential role to play, which is insufficiently advantaged in the United States. If you're a faith-based institution, you have tremendous resources, a community, a charitable instinct, a moral purpose, co-religionists. I would like to see more faith-based affordable housing developed, and I would like to see, it was a question in the chat, I would like to see the federal government recognize the role of incumbent faith-based institutions in a much more positive way than current law and regulations do.
Well, David Smith, Bess Freedman, Elena Patel, and Boaz Abramson, thank you all very much for taking part in today's panel. Many thanks to Joshua Plout and Ronnie Giuliano from American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and to our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Thank you to our program sponsor, which is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization that represents in the United States Israel's biggest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. Stay tuned for next month's Global Connections, Iran at War, What Comes Next, on Thursday, April 23rd at 4 p.m. I'm Robert Siegel. This has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.